Hello, my name is Kennedy Brown, and this is The Philosophy of Liberation, Mexican Americans in the Chicano Movement and Their Fight for Freedom, prepared for Intro to Chicanx Latinx Histories, History 17CH at the Claremont Colleges. In this presentation, I'll be analyzing an article titled Black, Brown, and Red, The Movement for Freedom Among Black, Chicano, and Indian. The Chicano movement was a social and political movement, key years being of 1965 and 1975, where Mexican Americans invoked ideologies rooted in cultural freedom and dignity. This movement was considered to be a radicalized one, due to its members adopting beliefs that rejected the Anglo-American status quo. They focused on reclaiming their heritage and embracing their cultural pride, which impacted the social indicators of Mexican American to Chicano. Formation of the civil rights group, like those of the Black Power movement, contributed to the progression of the Chicano movement. Thus, the Spanish expression la raza, or the race, has been used in historical contexts as an expression of identity for Chicanos, an indicator of unity and an acknowledgement of the race, who has fought for its rights and status in the U.S. since 1846. News and Letters is a Marxist humanist newspaper created to share the voices of the misrepresented and the marginalized, whose stories are told with the philosophy of liberation. Charles Denby, publisher at News and Letters, created this pamphlet to share voices of the misrepresented and marginalized, and stories are told absent from the lens of the oppressor. In the 50s and 60s, the term Marxist or Marxism grew into popularity, following the discussion of revolution and political freedom across marginalized groups. People like Chavo Craviobias, who in this article describes how the older generation of La Raza, or Mexican Americans, were not ready for revolution. They were comfortable with assimilation and approached their political aspirations differently. He states, "I'm tired of asking. Let's demand." And because I said demand instead of asking, I was considered a radical. Though the word radical has a negative connotation because it has been associated with groups that have different approaches to activism, radicals aspire to bring change, not just through reform, but revolution, a practice involving eradicating oppressive systems rather than merely addressing them. And this is what I think organizations like News and Letters and Chicanos like Chapo wanted to invoke. So, for my secondary source, historian Armando Navarro wrote about an avant-garde of the Chicano movement in Texas about the history of the Mexican American Youth Organization, and claimed it to be one of the sole Chicano organizations invoking social change. With the increase of Mexican American dropout rates due to the lack of equity and resources available to this demographic, Chicanos had no choice but to engage in education reform. They used terms like being pushed out, which demonstrates an acknowledgement of their systemic oppression in the United States, and a development of radicalism within their organizations. So, in this book, Navarro argues how education reform was critical to the foundation of the movement, and through changing the status quo in the United States curriculum and allowing Chicanos to redefine their identities in a white-dominated society, this contributed to their mobility in the movement. They understood that there were systemic barriers in place that perpetuated notions key to keeping Mexican people inferior. This led for them to advocate for demands like compulsory bilingual and bicultural education, integration of critical race studies, and the eradication of punitive punishments, and other things. But changing the culture of the United States education system was an opportunity for Chicanos to embrace their culture that rejected Anglo-American assimilation and promoted Chicano pride and cultural pluralism. So this very concept of taking control of the narrative in the education sense, I think, is the core to understanding the philosophy of liberation. Argentinian philosopher Enrique Dussel in The Philosophy of Liberation discusses this phenomenon and relates it to the influence of European philosophies, how practices in these philosophies have condemned the cultural standards and behaviors of marginalized people. He proposes that this theoretical and philosophical framework will promote a different new kind of thinking. So in his publications, when discussing the culture of the center, he is referring to the ruling elites of powerful nations. A people of the periphery indicates the people of African, Asian, and the Latin diaspora. He suggests that nations with the economic and political power like the United States have the ability to dominate marginalized groups such as the young Chicanos, or the people of the periphery. News and Letters, like other organizations at the time, possessed ideologies of this theory. The passion to retell their narratives separated from the control of Anglo-American, or the culture of the center. So for centuries, ruling elites of the United States has had both the economic, political, and social capabilities to marginalize groups deemed as inferior, thus able to create functions within our society that perpetuate systems of inequality. The Chicano movement was a cultural rebirth that inspired the new generation of Mexican Americans to reclaim their heritage, thus an articulation of philosophy of liberation. As Chicanos and other oppressed groups continued on their pursuit for revolution, we should commemorate the generation of Mexican Americans that embraced a will for freedom, a freedom separated from the power of white America, a freedom for la raza. Thank you.